1GLOOKSDON. There was blood on the council dais, blood on the steps, blood on the walls and the floor, and the shattered remnants of the mortal sword. Later Emma would remember it as a sort of red mist. A piece of broken poetry kept going through her mind, something about not being able to imagine people had so much blood in them. They said that shock cushioned great blows, but Emma didn't feel cushioned. She could see and hear everything. The council hall full of guards. The screaming. She tried to fight her way through to Julian. Guards surged up in front of her in a wave. She could hear more shouting. Emma Carstairs shattered the mortal sword. She destroyed a mortal instrument. Arrest her. She didn't care what they did to her, she had to get to Julian. He was still on the ground with Livy in his arms, resisting all efforts by the guards to lift her dead body away from him. Let me through, she said. I'm his parabatai, let me through. Give me the sword. It was the consul's voice. Give me Cortana, Emma, and you can help Julian. She gasped, and tasted blood in her mouth. Alec was up on the dais now, kneeling by his father's body. The floor of the hall was a mass of rushing figures. Among them Emma glimpsed Mark carrying an unconscious Ty out of the hall, shouldering other Nephilim aside as he went. He looked grimmer than she'd ever seen him. Kit was with him. Where was Drew? She was alone on the ground. No, Diana was with her, holding her and weeping, and there was Helen, fighting to get to the dais. Emma took a step back and almost stumbled. The wood floor was slippery with blood. Consul Ja Penhela was still in front of her, her thin hand held out for Cortana. Cortana. The sword was a part of Emma's family, had been a part of her memory for as long as she could recall. She could still remember Julian laying it in her arms after her parents had died, how she'd held the sword to her as if it were a child, heedless of the deep cut the blade left on her arm. Ja was asking her to hand over a piece of herself. But Julian was there, alone, bowed in grief, soaked in blood. And he was more of herself than Cortana was. Emma surrendered the sword. Feeling it yanked from her grip, her whole body tensed. She almost thought she could hear Cortana scream at being snapping at the guards, telling them to escort everyone from the hall. Now was a time of grief, not a time for revenge. Annabelle would be found. Go with dignity, Horace, or you'll be escorted out. Now is not the time. Aline helping Drew and Diana to their feet, helping them walk from the room. Emma fell to her knees by Julian. The metallic smell of blood was everywhere. Livy was a crumpled shape in his arms, her skin the color of skimmed milk. He had stopped calling for her to come back and was rocking her as if she were a child, his chin against the top of her head. Jules, Emma whispered, but the word sat bitterly on her tongue. That was her childhood name for him, and he was an adult now, a grieving parent. Livy had not just been his sister. For years he had raised her as a daughter. Julian. She touched his cold cheek, then Livy's colder one. Julian, love, please, let me help you. He raised his head slowly. He looked as if someone had flung a pail full of blood at him. It masked his chest, his throat spattered his chin and cheeks. Emma. His voice was barely a whisper. Emma, I drew so many Aratzes. But Livy had already been dead when she hit the wood of the dais. Before Julian even lifted her into his arms. No rune, no Iritz, would have helped. Jules. Helen had finally forced her way past the guards. She flung herself down beside Emma and Julian, heedless of the blood. Emma watched numbly as Helen carefully removed the broken shard of the mortal sword from Livy's body and set it on the ground. It stained her hands with blood. Her lips white with grief, she put her arms around Julian and Livy both, whispering soothing words. The room was emptying around them. Magnus had come in, walking very slowly and looking pale. A long row of silent brothers followed him. He ascended the dais and Alec rose to his feet, flinging himself into Magnus's arms. They held each other wordlessly as four of the brothers knelt and lifted Robert Lightwood's body. His hands had been folded over his chest, his eyes carefully closed. Soft murmurs of Avenue Atquay Vale, Robert Lightwood, echoed behind him as the brothers carried his body from the room. The consul moved toward them. There were guards with her. The silent brothers hovered behind them, like ghosts, a blur of parchment. You have to let go of her, Jules, Helen said in her gentlest voice. She has to be taken to the silent city. Julian looked at Emma. His eyes were stark as winter skies, but she could read them. Let him do it, Emma said. He wants the last person to carry Livy to be him. Helen stroked her brother's hair and kissed his forehead before rising. She said, "Jock, please." The consul nodded. Julian got slowly to his feet, Livy cradled against him. He began to move toward the stairs that led down from the dais, Helen at his side and the silent brothers following, but as Emma rose too, Ja put a hand out to hold her back. "Only family, Emma," she said. "I am family. Let me go with them. Let me go with Livy." Emma screamed silently, but she kept her mouth firmly closed. She couldn't add her own sadness to the existing horror. And the rules of the Silent City were unchangeable. The law is hard, but it is the law. The small procession was moving toward the doors. The cohort had gone, but there were still some guards and other shadow hunters in the room. A low chorus of hail and farewell, Livia Blackthorne, followed them. The consul turned, Cortana flashing in her hand, and went down the steps and over to Aline, who had been watching as Livy was carried away. Emma began to shiver all over, a shiver that started deep down in her bones. She had never felt so alone. Julian was going away from her, and the other Blackthorns seemed a million miles away like distant stars, and she wanted her parents with a painful intensity that was almost humiliating, and she wanted Jem and she wanted Cortana back in her arms and she wanted to forget Livy bleeding and dying and crumpled like a broken doll as the window of the council hall exploded and the broken crown took Annabelle. Had anyone else seen it but her? Emma. Arms went around her, familiar, gentle arms, raising her to her feet. It was Christina, who must have waited through all the chaos for her, who had stayed stubbornly in the hall as the guards shouted for everyone to leave, stayed to remain by Emma's side. "Emma, come with me, don't stay here. I'll take care of you. I know where we can go. Emma. Corazoncita. Come with me." Emma let Christina help her to her feet. Magnus and Alec were coming over to them, Alec's face tight, his eyes reddened. Emma stood with her hand clasped in Christina's and looked out over the hall, which seemed to her an entirely different place than it had when they had arrived hours ago. Maybe because the sun had been up then, she thought dimly, hearing Magnus and Alec talking to Christina about taking Emma to the house that had been set aside for the Blackthorns. Maybe because the room had darkened, and shadows were thick as paint in the corners. Or maybe because everything had changed, now. Maybe because nothing at all would ever be the same again. "Drew." Helen knocked gently on the closed door of the room. "Drew, can I talk to you?" At least, she was fairly sure it was Drew's room. The canal house next to the consul's residence on Princewater Street had been prepared for the Blackthorns before the meeting, since everyone had assumed they would spend several nights in Idris. Helen and Aline had been shown it earlier by Diana, and Helen had appreciated the light touch of Diana's loving hands everywhere. There were flowers in the kitchen, and rooms had names